So, the fell Xenologue. I'll start with my conclusion and then you can watch the rest of the video if you want my reasoning for it. For me personally, fell Xenologue was an overall positive experience. I enjoyed playing through it, I had fun. But I don't think the same would go for every Fire Emblem Engage player, and I don't recommend paying $30 for this blindly. Fell Xenologue works well enough when played at the right difficulty setting with the right save file. And even so, its implementation within Engage is flawed in many ways, and the same goes for the Engage DLC as a whole. So the way I view that purchase is, if this campaign alone is worth $30 to you, it's probably worth getting. Hopefully, if you're still on the fence, the rest of this video can help you figure that out. If you want to take a closer look at my live experience, I have a playlist of the playthrough I did on my channel here. Now let's get into what the fell Xenologue is and how it works. Fell Xenologue is a separate campaign that you can play anywhere between chapter 6 and the final chapter of Fire Emblem Engage. You play with both your old characters and the new DLC exclusive ones. Now in the past, separate campaigns like this, such as Cindered Shadows, would give you a set of units with predetermined stats and abilities to make sure the campaign difficulty is correct. You don't want the player to steamroll your campaign with endgame units, but you also don't want it to be unbeatable by people who dive into the well as early as chapter 6. Except they only did that to an extent. All units are set to a certain level for every map. They are in their base classes, so they cannot level up or reclass. But they come with the bond levels and inherited skills from your campaign, so players who use their late game saves do have a big advantage compared to those who dive into the well during the early game. Fell Xenologue also has 3 difficulty settings: normal, hard, and maddening. This can be adjusted between chapters independently of your main story difficulty. So this campaign effectively has 2 difficulty sliders: the difficulty you pick and how well your units are prepared for the enemies in that difficulty. And for what I'm getting online, that makes a huge difference in how you experience the campaign. And that's why I thought it was important to tell you exactly what my parameters were going in, since it's going to differ so much from player to player. Personally, I played on hard mode using the save file for my final chapter playthrough. I also didn't make use of the DLC only bracelets or any other DLC bonuses. Now I found this fell Xenologue much more difficult than the main campaign. Most maps are large, filled to the brim with enemies, and most of those enemies do not go down in one round of combat. In addition, your Emblem ring toolbox is often much smaller compared to the main game. You carry over all your Emblem rings and bracelets, but a significant portion of your deployment is limited to the DLC characters. And those DLC characters have bond level 1 with every emblem and cannot make progress, and they also cannot inherit any skills. So compared to your own units, they tend to be much worse. One of them in particular is likely to get one round KO'd and barely does any damage, but he is force deployed and a game over condition, so effectively every map becomes a bit of an escort mission. None of this is inherently bad. I like a challenge. To me, fell Xenologue's brutal difficulty was just hard enough to make it fun and satisfying to beat. But there were times where it was overwhelming and wearing me out, and I can definitely see why other people thought it was too much. Most likely, these other people were playing on maddening, which is absolutely brutal, or their save file wasn't as far into the game. And considering how much of a struggle some situations were for me, I can only imagine how unprepared they might be for the difficulty spike. That said, I would recommend anyone looking for a challenge within Engage to copy my setup, because it definitely delivered on that front. I had fun puzzling my way through the tactical gameplay as long as I took breaks in between maps. I did complain out loud frequently as I was streaming this, but in hindsight I'm glad I overcame what the game threw at me. Now let's talk about story and characters next. It's a little difficult to discuss without giving away things that are more fun to discover for yourself, so I'll keep it vague. The Xenologue's story is dark, and it reminds me a bit of Marvel's What If series. I enjoyed it for what it is, just like Engage's normal story. It has some legit good moments, and it's enhanced a lot by the amazing soundtrack, good voice acting, and how well it's integrated with the gameplay, particularly Nil's weakness as a unit. It has some unexpected twists that I won't spoil for you, but this is still Fire Emblem Engage we're talking about. My general take on Engage's story is that it's an overall silly story with some occasional great moments in there, and the Xenologue is basically that, perhaps with a somewhat higher density in great moments. But definitely some eye-roll moments in there too, sometimes to the point where they loop around and become good. The funniest and memeiest part of this is definitely the battle conversations between characters from different worlds, especially people talking to their own retainers or even themselves. Sometimes these get really frickin' dark, but a lot of them just feel like the writers enacting opposite day. As long as you go in with the right expectations, it'll keep you entertained between battles, but it's not peak fiction or anything. Lastly, I'd like to touch upon the DLC's impact on and the interaction with the rest of the game. I'm not gonna lie, this is probably my least favorite part of the DLC. There wasn't enough thought put into it. As I already said, I had a good time playing hard with my final chapter save file, but doing that means you'll have no time to use the DLC characters in the main story campaign. Since those units join at around level 20, they would also be very underleveled at that point. If, on the other hand, you recruit them early, they will be very ahead of the rest of your units. And since the paralogs scale off of your own unit's level, they will become a lot harder too. Apparently, the best time to recruit them is around the Soulm arc, but you do not want to play Fel at Xenologue at that point on anything above normal. And from what I know, normal mode is just too easy, to the point where it isn't really fun. None of this would be a problem if Fel Xenologue was implemented like Cindered Shadows in 3 houses. You play it once, and then the characters can be unlocked at any time. But unfortunately, every time you want to recruit these characters in a playthrough, you have to play the entire campaign from beginning to end. I enjoy playing it once on hard, but every future playthrough I'm doing of this is going to be on normal, and it will be more of a chore than enjoyable gameplay. While the Fel Xenologue bonuses are too time consuming to obtain, the DLC bonuses from the other waves have the opposite problem. They are forced upon you. For example, Wave 2 gives you 20 silver ingots and 30,000 gold. If I don't want these, I have to go out of my way to get rid of them through convoluted means. 3 houses had a much better implementation of this, where you could interact with the bed to choose the bonuses you wanted. Clearly, the game isn't balanced around you having these items, or else they would not be DLC. From what I can tell, this is always a problem for the Fire Emblem DLCs. If the game by itself is reasonably well balanced, then the bonuses from the DLC will usually shake up that balance. And if the bonuses are big, then so is that shakeup. I have not messed around with the DLC outside of Fel Xenologue, but from what I've heard, the impact DLC emblems and their paralogs have on the game's difficulty is that they just straight up flatten it. This is why it's extra disappointing that Fel Xenologue, which appears to want to create a curated experience for the player with static character levels, still doesn't deliver on that front. It only really works after you, as the player, do the work of balancing the game's difficulty setting around your file's progress. If you do that properly, then you can get a fun experience. But in order to get to that point, you either have to go through an unfun experience or get recommendations from other players. So, to summarize, if you're looking for a challenge with large maps with lots of enemies, and you have a save file ready for that challenge, and you don't mind having a dark and engagey story to go with it, this DLC might be for you. I do think the price of half a game is a bit much for what you get, especially considering all the issues I mentioned with the DLC's implementation, but if you're a really big fan of Engage's gameplay and you want to extend it, you could do a lot worse. Now, there is a non-zero chance I'm wrong about every single thing I said in this video, in which case, feel free to let me know down in comments what you think. Peace.